So my name is Stuart Keitting. I am the head brewer and one of the owners of Earthbound Beer. I'm pretty excited to be here. Actually, I moved here from Oklahoma in 2009, and when I came up to visit in 2008 to see if I wanted to move to St. Louis or not, Cicero's is actually one of the first places I ate at, and they were doing beer. Friday before last. We are one of the smallest breweries in St. Louis. We're located down on Cherokee Street, and we focus on a much wider variety of beers than the average brewery. Last year we released 76 different beers, and this year we will have released 80. So we push a lot of boundaries. The whole goal, our whole modus operandi, was to start really small, to focus on extremely small batches of beer. We do a 1.5 barrel batch, so after True Bloss and everything else, we get about 8 6th barrel kegs for each batch of beer we make. So very, very small. But since we're so small, that enables us to have a really big tap turnover, and it enables us to really experiment with ingredients and styles and processes that you maybe wouldn't want to try on a 7 or a 10 or a 20 barrel system. Our goal for the tap room is that if you come in once a week, every single week, without fail, we will have a new beer for you to try. And I think aside from 1 week when there was really inclement weather and we didn't turn over enough beer to actually clear a tap line, we've managed to pull that off. So 104 weeks in operation, and we've had a new beer on every week except 1 week. So that's pretty good. We have 5 beers for you tonight, and this is a very open format. I used to teach video game design and middle school French, so you can ask me questions in a variety of human and computer languages, and I'll do my best to answer them. I don't know if for those of you that have come in and you have perspectives on the beer that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear them and discuss those. So the other important thing is that we are in the middle of a big expansion. For those of you that have not come to visit us yet, our current brewery is at 2710 Cherokee Street. It is a 10-foot wide by 100-foot long hallway. So it is very rectangular, and it can seat about 36 people, 49 if everyone's friendly. It's also what the city says we can have in there. And so we have a very small tap room. The production area is visible. You can see how we do everything. Our new location that we're expanding to is on the same block. It's 2724 Cherokee, and it was a brewery from 1866 to 1902. And we're really excited to be bringing the brewery back to life. We'll have 2,500 square foot of space in the tasting room. We'll have a 1,500 square foot beer garden, and we have a subterranean production floor that is 20 feet underground and encompasses about 5,000 square feet. So we're excited to show it off. Yes, sir. It used to be the Cherokee Brewery Company, which I actually have the label rights to. So you will probably release some beers under the Cherokee Brewery Company imprint. All right, our first beer. How about that? So this is the Irish Red. It's one of our 4 portfolio beers. We have 4 beers out for distribution through Bevolution. This is an Irish Red. It is amber in color, trending towards copper. If you smell it, it's got a nice kind of caramel malty sweetness with a little bit of a mineral or roast character just underneath it, which carries through to the taste. So you get that nice mineral character in the beer itself. What that does is prevents the beer from being too sweet and too cloying, because it's not a very hoppy beer. So we're really careful with the yeast strain we use. We ferment it cold to give it that mineral character and prevent any fruity banana-like esters you get out of some of the British and Irish ale yeasts. We treat the water a little bit to make sure that almost a harshness comes through a little bit, and that prevents the beer from being dominated by hops and also prevents it from just being a big, sticky, sweet sugar bomb. And this beer actually won a homebrew contest the year before we opened under my wife's name. She came to visit, and we had to brew the beer. It was like the only weekend before the contest that we could brew the beer and make sure it was done. And I was like, all right, I hate to do this. Because it was one of the first times she'd come to visit St. Louis. I was like, we have to brew beer. Sorry. It's pretty great. But it was an Irish Red, and we had to use Irish ale yeast. And neither of those are things I like. Until I brewed this beer, I hated using Irish ale yeast. And until I brewed this beer, I really didn't like Irish Reds. But those were the rules for the contest, so we went ahead and did it. And I submitted it under Christina's name, and it won the Judges Award and the People's Choice Award. It was like, well, all right, that's pretty special. Because I made it, and I was like, you know what, I'll pour it at this event. I'll just get rid of it. I'll hand it out. And I tried it, and I was like, no, I'm going to drink all of this. And so it's kind of funny. We always joke at the brewery that we're known for experimental styles and really pushing the boundaries. And arguably our best-selling beer is this Irish Red, which is, I think, considered by a lot of people in the modern craft beer era to be a style that has long fallen by the wayside. But we're really proud that this is a very traditional, I mean, Irish Red was invented in 1985 by a Irish company that was looking to diversify their portfolio away from gross international pale lagers towards something new. So they brewed this copper color beer and didn't know what the hell to call it because they just didn't know what it was. And they're like, we'll call it the Irish Red. And that is the story of how Killian's Irish Red was born, actually. So Irish Red is a really invented style. It was invented in England, but then popularized here in America because it was something that was different enough from Budweiser and Miller and Pabst Blue Ribbon and everything else, but not so different that, like an IPA, that it was really alienating to early craft beer palates. It's pretty good, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So an Irish Red and an Amber in terms of stylistic characteristics, an Amber Ale, you're actually going to look for a little more carbonation. You're going to look for roughly the same color, but it's going to be a much more American beer. So what you're going to get is a really clean yeast profile. It's going to be a really neutral yeast profile. And you're going to get some American hops. A lot of Amber Ales are brewed with Columbus or Cascade hops. And Columbus hops, you can always recognize them. They smell like weed. Cascade hops always smell like citrus, like lemon and orange. And so Amber Ales typically are a little more full-bodied. They're a little rounder. They have no yeast character, and they're a little more hop-forward, especially in the nose. And really, I think if you had an Amber Ale from, the 1992, 1993, and an Amber Ale from now, you would discover that Amber Ales made now are much hoppier because the craft beer palate has changed that much over the past 23 years. Irish ales, at least as far as, because again, it's an invented style. Irish ales, at least as far as we can tell, should almost, anybody ever have Irish soda bread? Right? It's kind of got that same dry character to it, right? We were aiming for the same thing with this beer. So for us, at least, we treat Irish ales like an English pale ale, except we dial the hops back. We get the dryness through a little bit of mineral treatment in the water, and then we just use the Irish ale yeast, which when you ferment it cold gives it that nice, crisp, dry minerality. I think minerality is a word. Mineral character. All right. Like I said, I usually have a couple of beers in me at this point, and I'm starting a little dry, so joy of working at a beer factory. Yeah, do we have any other questions on the beer, or? Yes. Mm-hmm. So the question was, when we treat the water, what are we treating it with? Our treatment is actually twofold. The first treatment is we remove the chlorine and chloramine through filtration, and it's just an inline filter. You know what? I can totally do that Tony Robbins thing where I walk back and forth a point. This is great. So we filter to remove chlorine and chloramine, and then we'll add a couple of different types of salts depending on the beer. We might add a little bit of gypsum. We might add a little calcium chloride. I've seen some magnesium chloride added to beer, but we've never done it because it's not really necessary. St. Louis's water is fantastic for that. But usually we'll just add a little bit of gypsum or Burton salts, basically. If you're a home brewer, you can get Burton salts from the homebrew store. And that's actually a really fun brewing experiment, is to brew the same beer 2 days in a row and put Burton salts in one and not in the other.
What does the gypsum do? And then
So most brewing minerals, you guys are familiar with the concept of hard water and soft water, right? So what you end up with are like the different mineral ions in the water will cause the brewing ingredients to interact differently. So whenever you add calcium chloride or gypsum or brewing, they're usually just called Burton salts or brewing salts. Whenever you add those to beer, it causes the hops to come out just a little more harshly, and it causes some of the darker, maltier character to subside just a little bit. And they're called Burton salts because Burton-on-Trent, a town in merry old England, was really the forerunner of pale ale as a style, but they couldn't make pale ales for a long time because they didn't know how to kiln the malt. But once they were able to start kilning this pale malt so that you could make beer that was lighter in color, because every beer was basically brown for a long time, brewers in Burton-on-Trent discovered that for whatever reason their water was just producing these really incredible beers. You know, like the hops were just coming out way harder, and it was just a really unique flavor. You actually get the same thing from a lot of water in the Czech Republic as well. It's another mineral water area. It's a lot of limestone that, you know, water percolates through limestone. The limestone dissolves a little bit, and you get minerals in your water. So, question there, and then we'll come over here. The ABV on the Irish Red should be right around 5%. Unless my numbers are way off, but it should be about 5. Actually, I think almost everything we're pouring tonight is around 5, come to think of it. That's a good, I don't know, a lot of the beers we make, we design to be session beers because we want people to have 2 or 3 of them. And so anywhere from 4.5 to about 6% is our target spot for most of the gravity on our beer. And what's your question? Chloramines are a byproduct of the chlorine that is put in your water. Chloramines are basically chlorine binded to other organic particles that are in the water, and it just produces another harsh chemical off flavor in your water. And it's breakdown products from the chlorine disinfecting the water. So generally, I mean, it's fine to drink, but if you're, you know, like I think with my mouth, and if I taste really chlorinated water, or I taste a beer that was made with chlorinated water, which some of you may have had a few of those last summer when the water system had to undergo a deep clean, it's really noticeable. Chlorine in beer is harsh. It's very chemically. It's almost astringent, kind of makes your gums hurt a little bit if it's really strong. Something to look out for. A lot of times, a lot of breweries will, and St. Louis is, again, fortunate because can anybody guess who the largest water consumer in St. Louis is? AB. It's AB, correct. Anheuser-Busch is the city's largest water consumer, which means they dictate the water profile. So we fortunately have really good water for brewing aside from the chlorine. Here and then there.
Brief side story. AB Water. They instituted a lot of changes to cut down their consumption of water. And they cut down their consumption.
Oh man, yeah. So the beer that we have for distribution, I'm going to give you so many digressions. We'll have to someone will have to keep track of where I am in this narrative. All of the beers that we have for distribution, we brew at Charlottesville under contract. So we drive down and we brew on their system, and we do all the cellaring operations, package it, and then our distributor comes and picks it up. We do that because we can produce in a single day roughly 20 times what we can produce down there, what we can produce in our own shop. So when you think about, you know, we have roughly 80 tap handles around the St. Louis metro area now. When you think about trying to keep that much beer on draft when you're getting eight sixth-barrel kegs at a time, and most places are going through 1 or 2 sixth-barrels a week, that quickly becomes impossible. So we go down to Charlottesville, we brew on their equipment, we do all that work. It's a really pretty drive. It gets longer every time you do it. But it's gorgeous, and you get to hang out down there, and their brewers are awesome. But the upshot of all of that is all of our distribution beers we no longer carry in-house as a favor to our distribution clients, the retailers like Cicero's that are carrying our beer. So I love all of the beers that we have in distribution, and if I ever want to drink them, I have to go out and buy them, which is, I always feel kind of like a jerk because like I'll go somewhere and they're like, okay, and we have this Earthbound beer on. I'm like, I'll have one of those. And everyone that I'm with is just like, you arrogant asshole. And I'm like, no, I can't drink this anywhere else. I really like it. I made it. So yeah, I love this. Like, this is great. I get to drink all these beers I never get to have. So this Belgian Pale Ale, like I said, uses a Belgian yeast that is has some esters in it that produce banana and clove and pepper aromas. Some of them are phenol, some of them are esters. They're natural byproducts of all brewing yeast. Only in Belgium did the brewers really aim for those particular flavors as part of their beer profile. So ester and phenol production is contingent upon fermentation temperature. So this beer was fermented at roughly 78 degrees Fahrenheit while it was undergoing its main fermentation, and we can control that because the fermenters are temperature controlled. If we had fermented it at 85, the bananas would be so strong that you'd kind of think there was something wrong with it. It might even develop a bit of a cidery or like pineapple character. You don't ever want to go that far with your esters. But if we had fermented it at, say, 72 or 70 degrees, there would be very little ester production at all. I think this one could probably have a little more banana in it. This was an experiment with a new yeast strain because the strain we like to use we couldn't get. So I think we could have fermented this a little warmer, but I didn't want it to be a total pineapple bomb. So, yes, sir. On this particular one, we did very little experimentation. So our school of thought, like, because, I mean, you guys are familiar with beer styles, right? There's like 120 different beer styles now. They were all made up about 20 years ago. Some of them were made up like 5 years ago. It was basically an attempt at classifying all of these products and giving them set characteristics, but they're entirely made up. If you get a pale ale from Burton-on-Trent versus a pale ale from Yorkshire, or you get a pale ale from anywhere in Belgium, they're all different beers. And so whenever we tackle a specific style, what we'll do is we'll do some historical research, we'll do some product research. So we'll get a couple of beers and we'll try them. We'll talk through as a team. I have 3 owners, or 2 owners alongside myself, Jeff and Rebecca. We drink a lot of beer, obviously. And so we'll kind of nail down what we really think should be the defining characteristics for whatever beer we're brewing. So for the Belgian Pale Ale, we nailed this color without even thinking about it. We were like, we want this exact color on this beer because I want it to be lighter than the average English Pale Ale, because a lot of the Belgian Pale Ales were brewed with a Belgian malt, which is Belgian Pilsner malt, which is a lot lighter. And a lot of the Belgian hops, when Belgian Pale Ales were first made, actually came from Britain, and they were Fuggles and East Kent Goldings and these really noble British hops. And so we picked a noble British hop, and we basically picked a usage rate where we knew that if everything went the way we wanted it to, we would get this exact bitterness out of it with the exact herbal characteristics we wanted in it. It's got a little bit of a sort of a pungent, earthy British hops character. And then the yeast just does the rest. And so really, the yeast comes in a lot on the aroma, and then the hops come through way more in the bitterness of the beer. And like I said, it is a lower hopped pale ale. It's something on the more mild side for pale ales that you'll find, because we really wanted this beer to be all about the yeast. And the oats, which you'd never guess were in there because we're careful with those. But it's got a little bit of a lingering mouthfeel from some malted oats that we added. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really. So when you talk about stressing yeast, it takes a pretty high temperature to stress most ale yeast. So what happens when you ferment beer? I don't know if you've talked about fermentation at all with your parents, for example, but what happens is you pitch yeast, and it takes a big old breath, right? It consumes all of the oxygen available to it in the container, and then it gets to town, starts reproducing. So what happens is that reproduction is a pretty aggressive biological process, and it generates a lot of waste heat. So traditionally, they would have a lot of trouble controlling temperature in yeast, and most yeast could make it up to 85 or 90 degrees without ever being stressed under the brewer-specific term of the word. However, the warmer it gets, the harder a time it has controlling its waste byproducts, and that's why you get the more ester formation. So it's more of a byproduct than it is a stress product. And really, I mean, certain Belgian yeasts, you can run them higher than 90 degrees, and they'll do exactly what you want them to. But some of the more traditional British yeasts, like I think the London ESB yeast from Y Yeast, if you get that thing any warmer than about 74 degrees, it gets really fruity. It's like sweat, yeah. Yeah, all those banana flavors, yeast sweat. Perfect. Thank you. Yes, sir. Oh, absolutely. So this would be a fun time to talk about imposter syndrome, actually, while you guys are getting a new beer. When we decided to open our brewery, I was actually running an environmental nonprofit at the time, and my buddy Jeff was working at Whole Foods, and so we were basically, giving all of our time and money away for the greater good between the two of us. We were talking one night over a beer, and he said, I really don't like working for other people. I'd love to go out and start a business. He moved up here from Oklahoma as well. We were neighbors in college. And we were kind of talking through different business opportunities, and I was like, I've been homebrewing forever. I have this idea for a brewery. We're going to start as small as we can. We're going to open as cheaply as possible, and we're going to operate not the way that commercial breweries operate, but we're going to operate on just sort of a beefed-up homebrew scale with a meticulous attention to experimentation and batch quality. And so the whole thing from the get-go was, just because the big guys do this doesn't mean we have to. So what typically happens with smaller breweries is they open in an office park somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and they're out because the rent is cheap and it's a big space that's easy to deal with, and they'll immediately try to package their beer and sell it in grocery stores because that's what the big breweries do. Well, you give away like 85% of your margin when you do that. So we said, we'll open in a tap room, and we'll be very tap room focused, and we're going to make it the nicest place to drink you can imagine, and we're going to be in an extremely high traffic area, which I would have loved to have been on the Loop, but rent up here is really, really, really high. Rent on Cherokee Street at the time, really, really, really low. So we went to Cherokee Street, found a place with a lot of foot traffic. It was about 1,000 square feet, very small, and opened up the brewery. And of course, what did we do right after we opened? We're like, well, the big guys buy this yeast commercially, so we should do that. Big mistake. What happens is big breweries will buy, liter or gallon or 5-gallon quantities of yeast, and they'll inoculate them up to the size of pitch they need for the beer, and then they'll reuse it between beers because they're making 3 or 4 beers, at a time. Like they have a really small portfolio. For us, that doesn't work, right? We're much smaller. We push a lot of different beer styles, which requires different use of yeast, and we're really sporadic with when we brew and how frequently we use yeast. So we immediately ran into yeast management problems. Our yeast was stressing out because they weren't healthy pitches or they weren't pitched appropriately. So we got to the point where we found a strategy where we could get a couple of smack packs from the homebrew store. We set up a pretty good deal with them, and we would create a yeast starter for it and get that thing cultured up to what we needed for 45 gallons of beer and use it. And it ended up bringing our per unit cost of beer down by about 40% to just do it the way homebrewers do. So it was great. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is the mahlab ESB. This is a pretty fun one, right? Smell it. It's got that nice big cinnamon sweet aroma, and then you try it. Nice and crisp. So this is an ESB. It's an extra special bitter. It's a traditional British style beer. It's supposed to really highlight the maltiness. The hops aren't supposed to be present, but it's supposed to still be pretty crisp. We did that by using ground up cherry pits. There's an ingredient called mahlab. It's used in Turkish baked goods. It is the pits of St. Lucie cherries, these little tart cherries, and you grind them up, and every time you bake them, it undergoes this wonderful Maillard reaction, turns into this beautiful spice bread kind of baked good aroma. So we have a beer that smells like a good dessert, but then drinks really crisp and dry. And that cognitive dissonance between the smell and the flavor is I think, the strongest point of the beer. This is another one that I can't get in the tap room anymore, and it drives me crazy. Mahlab, M-A-H-L-A-B. One of my hobbies, in addition to brewing and lawyering and long walks on the beach, is going to Penzies and smelling everything, because they let you smell stuff. So I'll go to Penzies, and they know who I am at this point. They're like, oh, it's that guy. I tried to get them to play Pokemon Go with me while I was smelling stuff, and they were not having it. They were not happy about that. It's like catching Pokemon and smelling shit. It was great. So I was walking through and just smelling stuff, like I do every couple of weeks, and I hit mahlab, and I was like, oh my God, this stuff is incredible smelling. And I took a smell, and I was just immediately like, okay, I want to build an ESB around this. I want it to be a little more bitter than the average ESB, and I want the bitterness to come from the mahlab rather than the hops. And so we use Columbus hops in this at a really mild rate, just enough to give the beer its legs and keep it from spoiling. And then we actually add the mahlab, these little cherry pits. We grind them up, and we add them to the we've added them in the boil, and we've added them in the mash, because when you add ingredients to beer matters. If you were to add your hops in the mash, you would get some pretty good bitterness extraction, but you would get no aroma out of it. If you were to add certain aromatic ingredients late in the boil, they wouldn't isomerize in time to actually give you the flavor you want. So we've experimented with different mahlab usage rates, and what we've discovered is it really doesn't matter when you add it. It ends up smelling the same, which is great. That's a great thing. So if you ever want to make a beer with mahlab in it, you can add it at any point. You can add it with the grain when you mash the grain. You can add it at the beginning of boil. You can add it 5 minutes from the end of boil. I highly recommend, if you're a home brewer, making beer with mahlab, because it makes your house smell wonderful. It really does. Whenever we make it down at Charlottesville, everyone gets really excited. They're just like, it smells so good. It smells like cinnamon cookies. So it's fun. Brewers really like food in addition to beer. That's why we all kind of look the same. Yeah, do we have questions about the mahlab ESB? And if you notice the color on this one, it's sort of between the Irish Red and the Belgian Pale Ale. And the idea behind that is we wanted the color to be a little closer to a baked good without looking like a dark beer, which sounds crazy, but we wanted it to look like a nice toasty loaf of bread, because that helps signify to you. I don't know. Do we have any neuroscientists in here? Excellent. Because I'm gonna tell you some stuff that I may have made up. I don't think I made it up, but like I'm not a neuroscientist. So when you're tasting things, that's like 90% aroma. Your taste buds versus like you only have I think 7,000 taste buds or something. But your nerve receptors in your nose, your olfactory bulbs, are way stronger. You have way more of them. They're way more attuned. They're way more likely to discern between things. And I mean, I think taste-wise, you can perceive some things with your taste buds at like parts per million. There are a couple of things that your nose can detect at parts per trillion. I mean, your nose is really probably your most advanced sensory organ. I'm sorry. It's one of those weird things. And when you think about it, it makes sense, right? You smell something bad, there's usually a biological reason it smells bad. It's like, oh, don't eat that. So smell is also really fun for us, though, because the olfactory bulb, the part in your brain that processes smell, is directly proximate to the part of your brain that controls emotional memory. So what that means is the things you smell are really, really good at evoking and forming as well emotional memories. So if you smell like, the cinnamon rolls that your grandmother used to make, assuming your grandmother was a kind soul, you probably have positive memories. If grandmother was not kind, I'm sorry I brought it up. So smell is really fun like that, but part of getting things to smell right, because like smell is somewhat chemical, but it's also really localized to you as a person. So we might all smell the same chemical, and he might think it's burning rubber, someone else might think it's Band-Aid, someone else might think it's wood smoke, or peat smoke, but it's all really a phenol, and we're all perceiving it slightly differently. So you can actually help smell along with color. Like if this beer were pitch black and tasted and smelled the exact same, you would think it tasted different. It could be an identical beer except that it was pitch black, and you would be like, oh, this tastes really different, even though it doesn't. Or if the beer were a lot lighter, it would be the same thing. So we aimed for this sort of harvest gold, toasty bread color to really emphasize the smell of the mahlab. It's one of those weird, like, brain-hacking marketing things that I'm probably not supposed to tell you guys because you're going to know all my secrets. When I talk about doing weird stuff while brewing, what I really meant was reading Wikipedia. I read a lot of Wikipedia, and I read a lot of newspaper articles and books and stuff. So you have a lot of time to not do things when you're brewing. You just kind of sit there. You're like, okay, well, I guess in an hour I'll do something. I could like clean, but I'm just going to do it at the end of the day anyway. So I think we have another beer going around. That one should be the Spruce Gruit, I believe. It's very exciting. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. I would probably start with 2, depending on the beer. If it's a heavier beer, like a stout or something that's a little stronger in malt character, I'd go with about 2 ounces. And if you're going with something lighter, like this ESB, I'd maybe buck it back to about 1 ounce. You want to buy whole mahlab and grind it right before you use it because it'll keep pretty well, but once you grind it, it's kind of like nuts. If you like grind up peanuts or something, they start to turn. Same thing with mahlab. So go to Penzies. It's pretty cheap. You'll baffle them because I think I'm the only person that ever buys mahlab from them. And yeah, so 1 to 2 ounces. And yeah, I would say for a lighter beer, use less. Use an ounce. And it is a really fun ingredient. Yes. I have not tried Soulard Spice Shop. It's pretty easy to have better prices than Penzies. So, yeah, I will check out Soulard Spice Shop. That's what matters more than anything else to me. If I could smell stuff, that's great. We would go to Penzies because it was across the street from the bank, so that we use. Mm-hmm. So we're gonna have a fun conversation. We're gonna have a fun conversation about medieval history and trade laws. It's gonna be great, right? It's gonna be awesome. Thank you. So, what you're drinking right now is a Gruit. Does anybody know what a Gruit is? I saw a hand back there. White shirt? Gruit. Don't use hops. That is correct. So Gruit is interesting because as far as a noun goes, it refers to a beverage brewed without hops, as well as a particular bittering herb mixture that was used in the Middle Ages to bitter the beer.
Isn't it true that ale also meant brewed without hops up until about the mid-1860s?
Ale and beer were different things. Beer was brewed with hops, ale was not. So, so one of the fun things about Gruits is they can really fuck you up because a lot of times the Gruit mixture was mildly psychoactive in conjunction with alcohol. Like you can't actually buy a marsh Labrador or wild rosemary. The Latin name is Ledum palustre here because it's a scheduled substance. But that was one of the primary ingredients in the Gruit mixture that was used to get people lit all across the Middle Ages. The second fun thing is who do you guys think controlled who do you guys think controlled the Gruit? Yeah, the Gruit mixture was controlled by the church. The church taxed it. The church dispensed it. The church mandated what it was. Who do you think controlled the hops? The Germans. Anybody think of a time in medieval history when the Catholic Church and the Germans may have had a bit of a conflict? The Reformation, right? Anybody know when the Reformation was? 1519. When was the Reinheitsgebot passed? 1525 to 1540, somewhere in there. Started in 14. It was not enacted by the Landsraad until later. So what happened was the church had a monopoly on the taxation and use of Gruit, and all the German nobility had these huge, luxurious hop fields with a bunch of slaves, basically, to work on them, peasants, serfs, sure, serfs, slaves, same difference. You can't tell me I'm wrong. So they passed this purity law, right? Oh, our beer has to be pure. We can only use malt, water, and hops. In one fell blow, they completely destroyed one of the major tax bases for the Catholic Church in Germany. And what ended up happening, the reason that Gruit and hops are used in beer, they're both bitter, they both have special acids in them that we find pleasing, even though we probably shouldn't because bitter things are usually poison. We find them pleasing, and they also prevent spoilage microorganisms from growing because it lowers the pH of the fermented product. So whenever you make a Gruit, you have to try to mimic the action of the hops to make sure that beer is shelf stable while also not using toxic substances and coming up with different ways to make sure the flavors are right. Like if I had made a beer with wormwood, Artemisia thujaune, which you might know from absinthe, it would be so bitter you wouldn't want to drink it. This one here, I know you guys have been drinking it for a while, has spruce tips in it, and only spruce tips. Spruce tips, if you boil them, if they're young and you boil them in a tea, you get this really nice vitamin C, ascorbic acid, piney character, right? It's a great, bright flavor. It's actually really good if you have a cold. These are Sitka spruce. I had to fly them in special for this beer, but it was worth doing, I think. And this beer is actually really simple, right? It's light in color. It's a little cloudy because we didn't use any fining agents in it. And it's got that nice spruce character, right? Got a big old piney aroma. The flavor doesn't really come through as pine. It comes through as kind of a drier, more citrusy flavor. And there are no hops in this whatsoever. So it's and we've actually kept a few Gruits because we wanted to see how well they would keep. And they keep, in the keg at least, approximately as well as beers made with hops. I've not put any in package yet. That'll be our next fun experiment where I probably end up with a bunch of cans of undrinkable beer. Whatever, it's fine. Mm-hmm.
November
Right.
30, 1487 was when Albert IV beat Bavaria.
There we go.
And then it was signed off on the 23rd of April, 1516.
See, right after the Reformation, came through with the Landsraad. That is good trivia. So yeah, so on this beer, you'll notice it is it's a different bitterness, right? A hop bitterness is usually kind of up in front. This one is more of a, I don't know how else to describe it, but like if you were to chew on a bunch of dried cranberries, you know how that would make your gums sort of tighten up a little bit? Same thing with this, right? It's almost like mouthwash in a really good way. I don't know. I mean, it's weird. So when you talk about flavors and smells, you can describe things and people are like, you're insane. You're a crazy person. But like if you had a really drinkable mouthwash, it would probably have this kind of like almost minty, almost piney, slight lingering bitterness to it. It would probably also get you lit, but in a really bad way. Yeah, I think this one's really fun because for a lot of people, like a lot of Gruits we make will go pretty hard with different ingredients. We'll use yarrow, which is earthy, or mugwort, which is actually really sour and ends up making beers taste like sour beers even if they're not soured. Or yeah, mugwort's a great thing to use in beer. Or we'll use all sorts of just different bittering things. We've used cedar branches, juniper berries. We've used not vanilla. We've used a bunch of ginger, like a really ruinous amount of ginger, like just like grating it forever and ever and ever. Elderberries are a great bittering agent, but Spruce, I think, comes pretty close to a really nice, mild American hops, so it's a nice crossover between the two. And for those of you that this is your first Gruit, Prost. So absinthe is not illegal. Absinthe is one of those great pieces of marketing where they hype the really psychoactive properties of absinthe. The reason that like absinthe makes people behave like animals isn't the psychoactive properties of the wormwood, because you have to have nearly a toxic dose of the stuff to mess with you. It's because the stuff's bottled at 120 proof. So everyone's like, oh, I'm seeing the green fairy, and it's like, no, you've had like 9 cocktails, dude. It's a difference. Seriously, it's just that it's just bottled at 120 proof, and that's the whole point. It's also really bitter, and it looks cool, and there was that cool 9 Inch Nails video where he drank a bunch and saw conjoined Asian ladies, and that was awesome, but it's not really what happens. It's all hype and marketing, the same way the Reinheitsgebot is. Tied it back. Sir, told you if I got a few more beers in me, I got a lot better. It is. Yeah, and you actually can make a beer. You can get small quantities of wormwood and you can put it in beer, but it will be so undrinkably bitter if you're not careful that it's a trip. I mean, it really is like, it's strong. And if you guys do, if anyone is interested in making a Gruit, I recommend small quantities of yarrow, mugwort, and use, if you can find some sweet gale. Those 3 things together do pretty well, and you can just put them in a standard brown ale. Use maybe a quarter to a half ounce each in 5 gallons and make yourself a nice little brown Gruit, and it's pretty good. If you want a little more flavor, add some grated up ginger at the end of the boil. Start around. Good stuff. Yarrow, mugwort, and there's something called sweet gale, if you can find it, G-A-L-E. Yeah, use those, and if you just, I think one of my more successful ones were those 3 ingredients, some ginger about 5 minutes from the end of boil, and I did it in a nice light-bodied brown ale that had some pale chocolate malt in it. That provided most of the color, and it was just a nice, beautiful, like dry brown ale with these great herbal characteristics to it. Ooh, goodness. I don't know. I've just always called it sweet gale. The people at Cheryl's Herbs always know what I'm talking about for the most part. G-A-L-E. Yeah, Cheryl's Herbs are like usually pretty good. Sometimes they're a little spacey, but if you ask them for stuff, they can find it for you. They'll use thistle as well. They'll use bog myrtle, rosemary, wild rosemary. Ooh, boy. Thank you.
So with the wormwood, aren't there several different actual subspecies?
There are. You're typically looking for royal wormwood or Artemisia thujone. Yeah. So this next beer is the Pecan Chicory Stout, and I shit you not, it's based on an Usher song. It's the Pecan Chicory Stout, and it's based on an Usher song, but not like a specific Usher song, but just Usher generally and the way he composes his music. So the idea was to brew a stout that did not have the really strong coffee roast-like characters to it. We wanted to hit a more subdued bitterness, and we really wanted it to have kind of almost a buttery, mellow richness to it. So in the thinking on this is that the pecans, which you can smell in that aroma, are nice and buttery and slippery, just like Usher's voice. They kind of ride right along the top of the song there. The beer itself, the rhythm section, the grain bill, just chugging right along, not doing anything spectacular, but you know it's along for the ride, right? You got this great, it's got some chocolate, but not too much. It's got just a hint of roast, but it's not too coffee-like. Otherwise, it's pretty full in the mouth. And then you have that chicory that comes in, and that's the dude going, hey, every third beat. Right? That's the big earthy character. Chicory is this great, it's actually a weed, basically. It grows on the side of the road everywhere. And it's had it in coffee, right? The reason you put chicory in coffee is because it's a lot cheaper than coffee. And so it tastes close enough. It's got that bitterness to it. And if you roast it, it's got a little bit of a roast character, but it's not nearly as bitter as coffee. But it's a nice, it's anti-acid. And it's really good in beer. It's a nice, it makes a nice counterpoint to the standard coffee stout to have a chicory stout. Sir? You just got to let it burn. So down from Usher jokes. Yeah, the Usher lasers, they're inside my head. Tripping right now. Mostly loving this club. Everyone's going to listen to Lovin' This Club on the way home and be like, all right. And now every time you ever hear that song, you're going to think of this beer. It's going to be great. So yeah, this is, and actually, so the Spruce Gruit and the Pecan Chicory Stout have not gone on draft in a long time. These are fresh runs. They should go on draft this weekend at the tap room. So you guys are getting stuff that we have not actually poured yet this season. So, and I do like this as far as stouts go because it's pretty easy to go overboard with the stouts to just make them so roasty or so black that they just blow out your palate. Can't taste anything. But I like this one because it's pretty mild. It's pretty rich. It's pretty buttery. You could drink this and then drink something else after it and still taste it. Yeah, so it's good. I'm really jazzed that I was able to. I didn't even know until this morning which beers I was going to bring, and then I was like, sweet, rosemary, or like the Pecan Chicory Stout and Spruce Gruit are kegged up. I'll bring these with me. So, do you guys have any questions about the Pecan Chicory Stout? Yes, sir. I'll come back to you next. Yeah, go for it. What question? Oh, go ahead. Okay, that's a good question. So the question was, how do I come up with the ideas for some of the really left field beers? Oh, some of them do have names now. Some of our beers have names now. It's exciting. We were never going to name beers because we hated cutesy brewery names. And then we realized that if you make 75 beers, people start getting confused as to which pale ale is which. So our flagship pale ale is now called Second Lunch because it's like what we drink at lunch every day. I'm serious. Like that's like our lunch beer. So So some of the really left field ones, they'll either come out of some conceptual experimentation, like the rosemary juniper pale ale, which was one of my first weird quote unquote homebrew recipes. I was cooking a big Thanksgiving dinner for like 40 people, and it was right after I'd started homebrewing. And I was like, I'm gonna make this huge ass meal. All my friends are broke. They're gonna bring like $3 chuck to this dinner. And Stag and everything else. And I love Stag, and I drink Stag all the time. But I was like, if we're going to do this beautiful meal, I might as well make a beer to go along with it because I can do that weeks in advance. And so I looked at what I was going to do to the turkey and how I was going to do a bunch of other stuff. And I was like, all right, we're going to cook the turkey with rosemary and juniper, so it's going to be woody, it's going to be astringent, and it's going to be a pretty big bird, right? It's going to have some big flavors. So I decided to make a pale ale that's much on the dark side of the pale ale spectrum, and it had some rye in it, which gives it a nice spicy note. And then instead of hops at the end of the boil, we add, it's got hops at the beginning of the boil. And then we add rosemary, and like bruised rosemary and crushed juniper berries and let it steep for a few minutes. And you get this beer that is nice and astringent, clears the palate, and is woody and awesome. A lot of the ones are just like, we'll do historical research, or for like the toasted ravioli beer that we did, maybe the one you were thinking of. We did a toasted ravioli beer, yes, I'm sorry. What's that? Chicken and waffles, I was really stoned when I made chicken and waffles. I'm sorry, Mom, if you listen to this later. I was teaching Jeff how to homebrew, and we were coming up with different things, and he was like, could you make a chicken and waffles beer? I was like, yeah, I can. That one's fun. It's like a rye blonde ale that has some victory malt in it, which has almost a sourdough character, and then we added some smoked paprika, and some fenugreek, which smells a lot like maple syrup. And fenugreek. And a tiny little bit of salt. If you have salt below the flavor threshold, it actually makes malt taste more rich and food-like. So we end up with this beer that's like a blonde ale. It's a little spicy, a little sourdough-like. It's really full and rich, and then it smells like maple and smoke. Chicken and waffles. Yeah, and the toasted ravioli one, I actually made a Provel vodka tincture. And I got the dudes from Panic at the Disco to drink it on camera. It was awesome. Are we ready for pull and raffle, or where are we at?
I don't know. We might not be able to stop now. You're just kind of getting on a roll.
I was worried you were going to do the shepherd's crook and drag me off stage. Okay, we're good.
No,
yeah, so you had a question as well?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that was just, is the Gruit, is that Gruit we tried just called
Spruce
Spruce Gruit?
Gruit. Mm-hmm. You can put it on Untapped if you give it 5 stars.
Any other questions for Stuart? Any other questions? What does everybody think?
Oh, got 2 in the
another
back.
Question?
What do we got? Yep. That's a question for him.
Because I didn't know how many beers we were going to do.
And I had one in the back, green hat. I occasionally do. I've had King Midas. I've actually brewed a clone of that as well. So I really like Dogfish Head in theory. I've looked at his recipes. I love what he does. But a lot of times, I mean, they produce at such a scale that a lot of their stuff's pretty safe. You know, a lot of their beers are conceptually really cool, but I wish it had done just a little bit more. And some of it's also because you can't get it here. Like, you can't get it this side of the river. I've never heard of Left Brain.
And plus, I have all the beer that I want here. Not that I don't want this beer.
I actually don't get out very much
real-
either. I only drink my beer.
Yeah,
So
in any case, my point is that I thought all of them were kind of amazing, and they were all brewed at a really high quality. And there wasn't one that was just kind of like, oh yeah, this one. There was nothing that was sort of like that. And I think a lot of breweries are like that. And we've talked about it before. They were all sort of kind of had that sort of wow effect, at least to me. So. All right, well, let's see what you guys like the best, and then we're going to do a little raffle and give away some stuff. Mm-hmm. So the first beer that we tasted was the Irish Red. How many people thought that or liked that one the best?
it's a good showing.
All right, and what about the Belgian Pale?
You're not alone. I
One
like that
person?
One a lot. It's best
Two
as
people?
one.
1.5? That's okay. What about the ESB?
Yep.
All right. What about the Gruit?
All right. Gruit's
And how
forever.
about the Stout? And how many people think if they taste the chicken and waffles beer, that will be their favorite?
It's surprisingly good. We get a lot of people that are like, I don't know about that. And I'm like, why don't you try it? And they're always like,
I think you should bring it next time.
if I have it ready. Actually, I think I have to go through formula approval with the TTB for it, but
We
it'll
don't,
be
we don't need to do
distribution.
that for this class. We're not selling anything.
True. I could do that.
You know what I'm saying, people? Anyway,
Fuzzy Pickles.
would not be the first time
I
we've
will
done
have
that.
keg color approval for Fuzzy Pickles
We have
soon.
lots
We'll
of
be able- it'll be
uncolored
out.
beers that we distribute in this room. Just let me tell you something. Anybody, yeah. Anybody work for the